Shall we get things rolling?
Sure.
All right. Welcome to TooManyGames 2021, everybody. Thank you so much. Today we're going to be designing video games with difficulty in mind. This is the hard talk, designing for difficulty. First things first, a little bit about us. My name is Daniel Greenberg. I'm an adjunct professor of computer game design at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And I also run Winterion Game Studios, which is a small creative clearinghouse for videos about games. You can find that at YouTube at watch.winterion.com. With me is Alex.
I'm Daniel's wife, Alex Greenberg, and I work at ZeniMax, which is Bethesda, and now under Microsoft. I'm in the HR department there, and online you can find me on Twitter at GalaxQuest, where I collect adventure game point-and-click GIFs, if that's your thing. Okay, so first of all, we wanted to clear the slate by explaining to you what we're not going to be talking about today. That'll be a different panel farther down the line, I'm sure. There's a difference between bad games and hard games. And a bad game can have elements of difficult gameplay, but a hard game isn't always a bad game. And what we've distilled bad games, the definition is that they ultimately fail to meet their own design objectives. So we'll have to save that for another talk, but we'll let Daniel give you some examples.
Yeah, so just two quick examples of, again, bad versus hard games that come to mind. Everyone throws these two under the bus, so let's just get out of the way immediately. Superman 64 suffers from a lot of things, right? Buggy physics, collision detection, poor performance. It takes a character who is supposed to be at a certain level of, capability and magnitude and kind of, distills them down to almost very little actual capability. The controls seem clunky, and the challenge really comes from trying to overcome the failures of the design of the game. So the skill that you're developing is really about overcoming what the game wasn't able to do on its own. And there's a little similarity there with E.T., and I love Howard Scott Warshaw. I think he gets way too much flack for E.T. personally, but the issue with the game is if you don't have the instruction manual, if you don't spend time learning its weird idiosyncrasies and what makes that game function, it's very easy to just see a frustrating mess where you're falling in pits constantly. So really the challenge there comes from overcoming the angst of the design and sort of the frustration that comes from the way it was built, and then just learning the game's nuances, despite their admitted presentation issues. And now a quick look at the actual term difficulty, since this is the main topic of what we're talking about. Webster's gives us a pretty broad understanding of difficulty. The quality or state of being hard to do, deal with, or understand. So it's sort of it's almost a quantitative measurement of the amount of resistance between an intended action of some kinds and the consequence of that action, which in games we usually think about as playing the game, resistance the game puts us to us playing it, and then how much success or enjoyment we get out of it.
So what we're talking about in this panel is how you can add elements to your games and how they vary by genre. And we hope that will help you kind of focus the game you're designing and the kind of things you can add to it depending on the audience that you're doing the game for.
We've got a little video dialed up for you here, so hope you enjoy.
Don't stop me now. Don't stop me, 'cause I'm having a good time. I'm having a good time. I'm a shooting star leaping through the sky like a tiger, defying the laws of gravity. And I'm a race car passing by like a lady Godiva. I'm gonna go, go, go. There's no stopping me. I'm burning through the sky, yeah. 200 degrees, that's why they call me Mr. Fahrenheit. I'm traveling at the speed of light, and I wanna make a supersonic man out of you. Don't stop me now. I'm having such a good time. I'm having a ball. Don't stop me now if you wanna have a good time. Just give me a call. Yeah. Don't stop because I'm having a good time. Don't stop. Yeah, I'm having a good time. I don't wanna stop at all.
All right, and with that, let's start knocking some genres out. Arcade. Arcade is going to be sort of a catch-all for arcade machines, standees, even a brief mention of pinball here. Arcade games are designed to be hard for a number of reasons. The most obvious one is you have to cycle the players that you've got in front of the machine. So you want to make sure that you're still churning quarters, you're still churning players, but at the same time, that difficulty has to come from a place where there's some sort of engagement or interest in continuing to go on, right? You can't just have a hard game for hard game's sake. There has to be some ability to build up skill or interest. The player has to get a little farther each time so they keep dropping quarters in. These games are usually designed with some mechanics that take into account the desire to cycle players, things like timing mechanics. Think racers like Daytona USA, right, where the time is going down before you get to a checkpoint. The checkpoint keeps you playing, and as you continue to race, hopefully as you get better at it, you get slightly more out of each 50-cent, dollar, whatever you're paying to put in there. And then beat-em-up games, a lot of times you'll notice, bosses especially, mechanics you can't avoid, automatic counterattacks to attacks, things that are designed to sort of chip away at your life bars in these games for the purpose of cycling you through lives to make sure that you're dropping in more quarters, so you're willing to spend the $5, $6, or $7 it takes you to beat X-Men Arcade versus, you know, the 50 cents or a dollar for the initial buy-in.
For unplanned difficulty, what we mean by that are issues that happen with the games themselves, like the actual cabinet or the pinball table, sticky keys, controllers not lighting up, things that you can't really control that cost money to fix, that then kind of make the game inoperable or unplayable or really hard to play. The other thing, like we have here, with environment issues. Sometimes it's really loud. You can't hear what the game wants you to do. And then the technical issues, like I said. So. The problem is, I think for other, like younger players, they can't reach the controls or they can't see the screen. So there's, with arcade games, there's a lot of like inaccessibility issues as well.
Right. So when you're designing for arcade, you know, in that environment, you have to think about the environment you're working in, the cabinet itself, the players that are going to be coming to it, and their ability to play the game, again, functionally or unfunctionally. There is a brief parallel, it should be stated, between arcade games and mobile games. There's some similarity in the way they both kind of scale their difficulty to give you an introduction, kind of bring you in, give you a certain amount of play, and then start to extract more wealth out of you, right? A mobile game is going to let you download it and play roughly 2 to 3 hours of sunk cost before you get to a point where it's going to start trying to hit you for 99 cents to get through levels quicker. Arcade games are just sort of an older, more rudimentary version of the same idea, right? There's higher initial buy-in cost, and there's a more linear scale of how much you're paying to get through, as opposed to kind of the more, you know, exponential scale of cost that you see with, especially like minnows, sharks, and whales, as we describe, like mobile players and how much they invest in games. Next, we have action. Action games. Here we go. I know personally one of the biggest frustration points for me in action games is always how much time it takes me after I die to get back to the thing that caused me to die, right? It's one thing to accept that, okay, I didn't jump the pit, I didn't, you know, was able to kill that enemy, but now I have to run through 3 or 4 minutes of stuff I've already done to get back to that point. And that's one of the biggest pain points in action games generally. It's the amount of time between the checkpoint and the time the player gets stuck. So oftentimes the checkpoint will be, especially in some more difficult games, the checkpoint can be the start of the level, or if you have to continue, the checkpoint can be the start of an entire series of levels. In particularly notorious games, it can be starting the entire game over again if you die. And there are some modern tools that we've gotten that have kind of started to been added to games to alleviate this a little bit, right? We think of things that have come from emulators like save states, the ability to rewind. It's not that it makes that part of the game any easier to play, it's that, oh, if I can get 10, 20, 30 tries at this thing within a couple of minutes instead of a couple of hours, it becomes much quicker that you can develop the skill to get past that point. It's sort of a training mechanism, and it's more of a frustration alleviation, but that really is also a difficulty alleviation because the frustration tends to be harder for players than the challenge itself.
For the difficulty levels on action games, they're generally made for small memory chips, so you can't save 3 versions, like easy, medium, hard. That doesn't exist. Or the designers don't have the ability to change the environment, so you can't make less lava pits or bigger platforms for the player to jump on. So these games in the beginning are not designed for different skill levels, which is kind of a bummer.
Yeah, the good news is we've gotten a little farther right developmentally. We obviously have way more memory to work with nowadays. We have engines that allow us to build, you know, and develop out levels. You know, we can kind of sketch this stuff up a lot quicker than we used to. So you can start to think about these small adjustments in difficulty can come from more places than just, does the bird hit me for 2, 3, or 4 points of damage? It can be things like where the platforms are placed, the number of platforms that are available, maybe the texture and material platforms. Does this platform have ice on it? Well, in medium difficulty, it's a dry platform. In hard difficulty, it's an icy platform. And in easy difficulty, it's a platform with another platform beneath it, right? It's very easy for us now that we have sort of this luxury of developmental speed and memory to craft our experiences this way, where before we didn't really have, on an NES card, you weren't going to be fitting that many additional things into memory and reloading those same sections for so many various parts of the game. So it's going to force you to really scale down the content of your game otherwise. And difficulty settings can adjust more, right? We can tweak consequences. How far back do you have to go? How your abilities may function. Just think a little bit beyond the scaler. From action games, the punishment is usually not as severe. The problem is learning the tool. So whether it's giving the player more functional tools to adjust to the jumping, the running, or adjusting the levels in such a way to make them friendlier or harder to players. Just try to be flexible when you're designing or crafting your difficulty for these.
Fighting games. So the hardest part about these for me was memorizing combos for special moves, finishing moves, getting my hand to stop cramping. Especially for games with large rosters, you need to practice and learn multiple different combos.
Yeah. These are generally competitive games. They generally have a fairly high skill cap. And as such, we'll get into the discussions of multiplayer later, right? But there's a larger gulf between players in fighting games than there are in a lot of other genres just by the nature and design of it. So for fighting games, you want to think about there's an interplay of skill and luck. The more luck you have in the game, the more you bring players that may not necessarily win up, and the more you bring players who should always win down. And fighting games generally tend to do the opposite. They tend to pull the skill cap upwards. There are some games that are very clever and flexible about how they do this. There's a reason Smash Brothers is as popular as it is. It can be played multiple ways. You can do no items final destination. You can let the randomization of items drop in, and that's going to give, the sense of luck that adds it, right? 2 players versus 3 players versus 4 players, again, inherently changes the experience a little bit. Obviously, your skilled players are still going to be effective, but it's going to give other players an opportunity or chance just based on the freneticism or randomness of the fighting. And because Smash Brothers uses a similar control scheme, really for all the characters function roughly on the same control schemes, right? Forward and A to smash, up and B to do special ability, so on and so forth. Because they have that same control scheme, you can have a roster of, 90-something characters?
And growing.
Is it 90 now exactly? 89. So you have 89 characters, and you can jump in and have a rough idea of what you need to hit and what combination to play, not master them for sure, but at least play them functionally. And by lowering the amount of education you need for the buy-in, like being able to start that game at least a certain thing, that invites so many more people to play that just by virtue of that, now some smaller subset of that may keep playing until they get to expert or, master level at the game, but it's going to create a much, much larger base of users.
Sports games. So a big issue with a lot of the sports games nowadays are recreating the athletic acts such as bowling or swinging a tennis racket or golfing with controllers. So if the act is now a series of button presses, even though you are good at golf in real life, you are not necessarily good at golf on the Wii. The computerized teammates don't always behave as the player wants them to behave. And the player also has to focus on strategic decisions that normally in real life the coach would be worried about. So you have to kind of focus on strategizing where the players are and what your team is what play they're gonna do. And that's something that if you're actually playing, you wouldn't have to be concentrating on. So it's a different kind of mental exercise.
Yeah, sports games are interesting because the people who play them can bring in a tremendous amount of knowledge about the world in which these games occur because with limited exception, things like Mutant League Hockey, most of them strive to an extent to be pretty accurate recreations of the game, which means if you understand the strategy behind them, if you understand, on 4th and 1, I should be maybe doing a draw or a quarterback dive instead of, say, a Hail Mary. Understanding those, rules of the game give you an edge, but the actual functional play of the sport is so radically different from controlling it, with really the exception of things like Wii Sports. that the skill transfer is almost entirely mental and not physical at all. And just by sports' physical nature, it makes for a unique kind of difficulty curve because the people who might be bringing a lot of sports skill into this genre don't necessarily bring it into the video game sphere. The other big disparity you have here is the disparity of matchups. Most games intentionally try to design some level of balance between, the different characters. So we were just talking about fighting games. Fighting games do have a tier, right? And different characters kind of fall into different tiers just by virtue of it's very hard to balance a game to be completely and totally balanced. Sports games are fighting up against the realism of having all these these licensed athletes and teams, right? Talk about Tom Brady likes the character. But they have their stats in an attempt to recreate their real life equivalents. And it's not always fair. If you find a game that lets you play as the 1992 Dream Team, you are going to walk over all the other international competition just by virtue of the rosters being unbalanced and the players being unbalanced, but you are designing it unbalanced on purpose, right? It's unbalanced because it's trying to effectively capture the real life lack of balance. At that point, your players almost have to self-police, and you just kind of let the players dictate their own difficulty scales by what teams they choose to play as. But you're not really designing for balance in that respect. You're almost letting your players set their own difficulty by who they decide to play in the game. Shooters or shmups. Naturally, a great genre to introduce difficulty. Many shooters have very punishing designs. A lot of them go with one-hit kills or very few hits necessary to kill your ship. And death often has a pretty high consequence. Usually it can be something like losing your power set entirely, right? Going from having multiple options and lasers and missiles to back down to a single shot. But the game doesn't usually give you the opportunity to build much back up. You typically drop right back into roughly about where you died, maybe slightly behind. And now you are dealing with the difficulties that killed you with less ability to fight back against the thing that already killed you once. So it's very common to see people kind of hit a wall in shooters, do well for a while, die, and then die 2 or 3 more times very quickly, and that kind of ends their run. You need to keep your players' objectives in mind when you're designing a shooter. Is it a score attack type game? Are they trying to get a high score? Or is it something they're doing for completion? Is there some sort of narrative that you're conveying? And try to design your difficulty around that. If you're trying to migrate players through your game once and the motivation isn't necessarily how many points they get or how quickly they do it, but you're trying to tell some sort of story with it, you probably want to go slightly more forgiving with your difficulty and your mechanics in order to facilitate it. If you are making a more traditional score attack game and you're trying to develop in such a way that the players are really sort of challenging themselves to do a perfect or a near perfect run, then you can go with some of these more legacy, hardcore mechanics.
Another thing to focus on when you're designing a shooter is the hitbox range. So like if you are getting close to a bullet, how far do you have before it gets you or when it passes by? Or if you're attacking a boss, how do you know what you're hitting is the vulnerable area? Does it blink? Does it make a sound? A lot of those things sometimes are sort of nebulous, so you don't know how well you're doing until you die.
Yeah, so telegraphing or communicating to the player, how it's going is always key. Communication is key, as they say. First-person shooters. I think the most immediate thing with first-person shooters as we get into our first-person genre is there are things outside of your field of view. In all the genres really up to this point we've talked about, you have a view of yourself, your immediate surroundings, the antagonists around you. First-person shooters absolutely put threats immediately out of your view. Could be people above you, people behind you, flanking you from a hallway. And as such, in first-person games, not all the threats are visible to the player, so how do you communicate to the player that something is occurring, right? Some games are a little friendlier. They'll give you like a red flash on the screen, but maybe on the side of the screen to give you an idea of where you're being shot from. Depending on how many hits you can take in a certain first-person shooter, you might be able to endure a couple hits, run for some cover, realize what's going on, regroup, and attempt to fight back. In more aggressive shooters like early Rainbow Six games, you get plunked a couple times, you immediately drop. And those games prioritize strategy and positioning because of how lethal they are. And then there's the ability to use things like our little invisible specter there. enemies that aren't entirely visible or occluded. First-person games are very aesthetically, attached. That is to say, the enemies in the world all kind of fit into a place. You don't try to have them stand out as much, and it's very easy to die from enemies that are kind of part of their background or blending into their background. But you can get really aggressive and do things like invisible enemies.
One of my favorite elements of FPSs are using the environment as another weapon or another enemy. So like if you're designing a level and you're using darkness, like you walk into a room and suddenly the lights go out, the adrenaline goes up in the player, they don't know who they're fighting or what they're looking at, they have to rely on their sound of an enemy breathing. And then the other thing for like something like Doom, using the layout, like the maze design of the level itself, or adding damage zones like cliffs or lava pits, that kind of thing. And again, for Doom, their nightmare mode, which again, they've started introducing the hard, easy, hard, don't hurt me daddy levels. So mechanisms with difficulty settings start to play into how you're designing a game. In Doom's particular version, you have respawning enemies that move quicker. They remove the ability to use the cheat codes, which I really relied on, which kind of sucks. And GoldenEye added more mission objectives. So those kinds of things you can sort of add as you're ramping up the difficulty level in design.
Yeah, I think we, especially in first-person shooters, we tend to think of scalar difficulty adjustments almost all the time, right? Fewer health packs, get hit harder, less ammo, just number-based increases in difficulty. But there have been some really creative difficulty adjustments, and when you're designing first-person shooters, try to think of it, what it is your players have to accomplish in the game besides just shooting enemies and walking around, and how you can make those tasks more difficult, because the player having those extracurricular activities to work with can introduce difficulty in a way that may be even more intriguing to them than things just hitting harder. MMORPGs. Speaking as someone who was lost in this for about 15 years, group coordination might be amongst the hardest things in an MMORPG, depending on exactly what it is you're trying to do. I am a teacher. I have to sit in a room of 30 people and lecture to them, but they have to listen to me, and they're paying to be there. It is much harder to convince 40 people over, dating myself here, Ventrilo or TeamSpeak, that you need to do what I said. I need you to stand over here. I need you three over there. No, please, why aren't you moving, right? And that can be very, very challenging. There's a lot of real-world management skills that come into this. The ability to manage multiple egos, to understand everyone's individual class well enough that you can explain to them why they need to be doing things a certain way. And because there's such a wide range of skills and such a codependence that comes into MMO at the top end of it, it creates sort of a wide range of skill levels. And as such, the MMOs generally have to design for those in mind, right? You're going to have to make content for individuals. You're going to have to make content for groups of 3 or 5. You have to make content for groups of 10, 15, 20, and so forth. And understand that, yes, the numbers have to change or go up, and the gear's going to get better, and they're going to have to be able to be more precise and more exact and extract more DPS and play more efficiently as they move up that skill. But you do have to factor in that the larger the group gets, inherently, there is sort of a natural impediment to that group, and the vast majority of groups going in are not going to have the laser coordination that smaller and smaller groups do, meaning you have to kind of adjust your difficulty with that size of group in mind. And then there's the monthly meta, as it were, because you're always adjusting your MMOs to account for, now bartenders are doing too much damage, so we need to bring bartenders down in this next patch. But if we bring bartenders down, then baristas are gonna, everyone's just gonna take 10 baristas to the dungeon, and so now we have to adjust, again. The way people play the game according to the way that you are adjusting the game. As you are working on individual class balance, you need to remember it's going to have an outsized impact on players at the upper end of your content. So adjusting the difficulty of the content versus adjusting the difficulty of the meta, there's pros and cons to each. Just consider why you're making the adjustment and how that affects the other groups in different tiers of content, and adjust accordingly. Non-MMORPGs.
So RPGs. Grinding, you know it, you love it. The process of fighting enemies so you can get enough XP to get through the final boss of the dungeon. This can take hours, creating player frustration, and can drive players to quit. Some games can actually scale their difficulty player to the level, which removes the element of grinding, but then you kind of get stuck when you're at a level and you're trying to defeat somebody and you can't go out and grind to raise your level, because when you come back, they're going to be at the upper level as well. So as a designer, just keep in mind, like, what is your reason for awarding XP? Is it to reward the player engagement, to give them some control over the difficulty, controlling when new mechanics are introduced, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and because players will use that, that control over where they're going and what they're doing, you need to think about what you're asking them to do. There's usually your main thread and then some number of additional open world objectives. Those side quests create a bit of a design challenge too, because like the randomized content in your game, you don't necessarily know how much of it your player is going to do. You want to reward them for doing it. You want to give them some sort of benefit for going and doing these extra missions. But if you design your difficulty around the gear that comes from those missions, they go from being optional to mandatory. If you don't design around them, the players who want to do this stuff, you risk making the content too easy for them, even though that's not their intention. They want to experience the whole game, but they want to experience it at a certain difficulty. So it's a very tough balancing act to follow, right? You have to give some sort of reward for the side content. If you give the reward for the side content, you risk unbalancing the main content. You do have an opportunity to create a lot of harder bosses, quests, or dungeons also. Think about things like Emerald Weapon. The side quest is a great tool for an RPG developer who wants to introduce additional difficulty to make it optional, right? A lot of games, just by their design, are primarily mandatory in their content, and therefore any additions of difficulty tend to be mandatory difficulty additions. Kirby's really, really good about this as a side note, but generally, if you have something that you can make a completely optional ancillary side quest, and RPGs are beautifully set up to do this, you have a great opportunity to put like extra hard content in your game to satisfy people who are looking for that challenge without necessarily punishing the players who aren't. And then class balance. RPGs are a great example of the sum being, greater than or the total being sum greater than the sum of the individual item. When you have a mixed group together, they kick butt. So you have to think about the composition of the group you're bringing. Does your game allow that to be modified, right? Is it like Final Fantasy 1 where you can do a 4 white mage run if you want to, or is it a later game where the characters you're getting are sort of pre-designed and they have the skills that they have, and you have to just kind of make do with the design as it's statically provided? Because the ability to combine those unique abilities can itself increase or decrease the experience that the player has difficulty-wise. Easy games.
Action RPGs. So the first thing I think about is the choreography that you have to learn between like reacting to an enemy's attack and the timing windows before an attack happens, like learning those tricks, like when is the enemy winding up in order to swing his sword, or what is their horse doing before I charge at them. Those kinds of things you can adjust, so the difficulty setting, you can like elongate them to make it a little bit easier for the player, or shorten them to make it hard as hell. And then the diversity of the opponent's moves will kind of influence the player's gear choices and how they use the environment and kind of react to the fight itself.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit earlier about the time between doing something, failing at it, and then running back to do the same thing again as being frustrating, being a source of difficulty. Consequences, same idea, right? The consequences of death can be a big adjustment to difficulty. The more lethal an opponent's attacks, that is to say, if the opponent does one big swing and hits you and it's a one-hit kill, you already are going to get less opportunities to practice dodging that one-hit kill. On top of that, a number of these games will have consequences for death, right? Losing gold, running back to your body. It can be incredibly punishing, like losing maximum hit points, losing the ability to summon NPCs. These consequences will increase the amount of time between your attempts, and by increasing the time between your attempts, increase the frustration and thus the difficulty. So think about how long a run back you're creating for your players and how much time you're sort of almost making them sit in timeout between trying to do the thing, failing at it, and then trying to do it again. Because there's obviously you want some level of punishment or frustration because it's inherent in your design. But at what point, where do you find the happy medium between giving them a meaningful punishment so they are afraid of dying, but giving them the opportunity to play enough so that they're not going to die as much?
And then another thing to keep in mind is the player's play style. So if you want your player to be sneaky and stealthily attack everybody without anybody knowing, and the reward for that is much greater than someone who wants to hack and slash their way through the level and just murder everybody. Those are kind of things that the player might struggle with if they just want to run through and murder everybody, but in Dishonored, that's not really an option. Players may find their desired play style makes the game harder because they can't just do what they want. They have to adhere to the game's style preference.
Yeah, we ran into that. We've been playing a couple of the newer Assassin's Creed games. And with Assassin's Creed Origins, the way that the character of Bayek was kind of portrayed in the plot and the way the game played, I was comfortable with doing a lot of the stealth-based elements that the game kind of coaches you into. But with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, every NPC I'm talking to in the game just naturally sells Cassandra as this larger-than-life Greek hero.
A warrior.
Right? So eventually I got so frustrated so I'm this big tough warrior and I have to very carefully sneak and camp and spend an hour and a half systematically assassinating guards until I can complete the mission. It just didn't feel like the character in the game I was being told, plot-wise, and there was such a sort of a disjointed relationship between the two. Even when it's not a source of difficulty, players are going to find times when they want to play games certain ways, and this was an example of it. And I immediately turned the game down to easy, if only because then it becomes sort of just more of a beat-em-up action game. I can run into these rooms, and the character and the actions that I'm taking as that character suddenly match up narratively with what I'm actually seeing in terms of gameplay, even if it shortened the experience a little bit. Which I guess is good for our backlog. Survival horror. Survival horror begins with scarcity. If you want to make someone afraid of something, start taking tools out of their toolkit. My analogy with my students in class is a golf bag. The more tools you have at your disposal, you look at a challenge, you identify which of your tools you use to deal with that challenge, and then you confront it. Survival horrors, a large chunk of their difficulty comes from the lack of ability to deal with the things that are being thrown at you, making running a natural decision, right? If you're being attacked by zombies and you have 10 bullets and there's 5 zombies and there's gonna be more in the room after that, all of a sudden you might be able to shoot one that's very, very close to you, but beyond that, it has become a matter of flee, right? Get somewhere safe, try to run around them, escape the room. Not being able to shoot through waves of enemies, right? It's almost a genre changer at that point. You kind of go from action to survival horror. And even games like Resident Evil played with that borderline and kind of pivoted between the two at points based on how much they give you and how much they don't give you.
Another fun design element is adding the element of anxiety. So you can add jump scares, you can add ambushes to create tension and startle the player. Like I said, with the FPSs, you can use darkness. It kind of causes you to use other ways of playing. Or when you run into a room and there's somebody drops onto you and you have to unload your ammo or run away screaming. Levels are designed the way the actual building is created, so there's poor lighting or tight corridors, blind corners, all those kinds of things add the element of tension, which is kind of more like a movie designing game element.
Yeah, and then finally big baddies. Big baddies, I think Nemesis, they're much larger and stronger than the player, intentionally so. When all else fails, the constant sense of being pursued, the lack of safety, with the exception of the ink ribbon rooms, there may not be an enemy in the room, but someone or something is hunting you and that you are not inherently safe just because you don't see an immediate threat, adds that extra layer of tension. Tension makes players act quicker, make faster decisions, maybe not necessarily as well thought out, and is itself a minor adjustment in difficulty.
Yay! So I'm only allowed to talk about these 3 bullets. But point-and-click adventure games, there's a lot of things to concentrate on when you're designing one. One of the things is to You may want to avoid out-of-genre puzzles. Nobody wants to go through an adventure game and halfway through they're stuck in a maze or they're fighting an enemy and they don't know how to do that and they don't have a cheat code like IDDQD. So those kinds of player challenges that are outside of the realm of like logic sometimes frustrate a player. These games are normally plot-driven, but adding out of genre elements kind of make it. They draw out the game. They make it a little frustrating. You kind of have to like look at the hint book or go online, I guess. So I would suggest to design the puzzles to kind of complement the experience of the game that you're building and make it fit within the world of the setting. The next thing with adventure games, soft locks, which have been. So when you're playing a game and you're going along and you don't know that you can't beat it because you ate the apple that you needed to give to the fawn, or you don't have the key before you got thrown into the dungeon. These are things that I think are more of a design issue than a challenge to the player. So those may be something that you may want to concentrate on. And then in addition with soft locks, I would say deaths, unnecessary deaths. You've heard, I'm sure, save early, save often. For adventure gamers. There are a lot of newer games that allow you to die, but then you can just go back to the thing that you did. So you don't taunt the wolf, and then you don't die. But there are other games where you have to go back to your last save state, and that can be frustrating for a player. And then the last thing for adventure games is a phrase we call moon logic, which is using logic that doesn't normally fit into the daily routine. So if I need to fix a pipe, I would not go out and get an actual monkey from a cage and hypnotize him and make him into a monkey wrench, but that's what you do in an adventure game. That's just how you get things done.
Yeah, so with Moon Logic, the idea is to set the player expectations if you can, right? If you give them an easy puzzle at the beginning of the game that has that sort of weird absurdism to it, right? I need a toadstool, so I literally take a toad and grab the stool that he's sitting on, and that's my toadstool. Right now, at least you've set the player expectation for the sorts of flexibilities that they need to have creatively with their mind when it comes to these puzzle-solving games, because so many of them just go off the reservation.
And I could, again, talk about this for days, but I think a lot of times when you're designing an adventure game and you need to choose the art style that's based on your rules of logic. So if it's a very zany, like Who Framed Roger Rabbit kind of game where it's cartoon rules, that makes sense that you can pick up a toadstool and it becomes a toadstool. But if it's realistic, if it's like Myst, where everything is realism and you can't do like a wacky thing because that wouldn't be realistic in the setting of the game.
Physical games or rhythm games. These often require a certain amount of athleticism and stamina. These are some not necessarily things all players can meet, so we have a difficulty that's already baked into these that you don't have in a lot of other genres is, can people make the movements that we're asking them to make? Some games like DDR and Rock Band require you to perform in a way that isn't necessarily similar to the real-world counterpart, but is still in some way highly demanding in physical activity. And it can be exhausting at best and impossible for some people. So consider that accordingly and think about your difficulty from the scale of not only is the task you're asking them to perform in-game difficult to some extent, but the method by which they're handling their input is inherently difficult. Which leads into accessibility, really. It can be really hard to design these games with accessibility in mind. The more physical your game, by its nature, the harder it's going to be to make this game available for everybody to play. You can do easier modes, you can increase the timing windows for successful hits and the like. But the ability to perform still exists. You still have to actually be able to perform these inputs. So there are great hardware options. I think about the Microsoft controller as a big one here. Try to design with those sorts of options in mind, if at all possible. Can you make your game accessible by allowing additional inputs, by allowing additional controller types to be added in here? Even though it may necessarily reduce the immersion of something like a dance game to be able to use a non-dance based input for it, you are opening the game up to more people and also hardware durability.
So like the arcade issue, things break down, things get sticky, things get broken, and you need to tape them together, like this pedal with the knife getting taped to it. These are things that can kind of make your game unplayable after a while, so it's something to keep in mind when you're designing these.
Yeah, so if you build with those accessible controllers in mind, it means you're already building and designing to have alternate controller inputs, which means 10 or 15 years down the road, when all of your Fisher-Price guitars are broken and nobody can get them anymore, it may still be possible to play your game because you can use alternate control schemes or people can make their own controllers. Simulators. Simulators are a fun design challenge from a difficulty standpoint because usually they're to some extent about teaching how to do a real world thing, which means extrinsic knowledge is a huge difficulty adjustment. How much do I already know before I come into this world, you know? Do I have familiarity with performing surgery already? If so, I'm probably gonna have an easier time trying to remove an appendix when playing life and death than if I've never opened up a medical textbook in my life. So balancing these games, it isn't always necessarily a priority because depending on the type of game you're making, if you're making more of a trainer or like a serious game simulation and the goal is to actually educate somebody to do the real world corollary, then difficulty is less of a factor for you. You want it to be as realistic as possible, and surgery is hard, so this is going to be a difficult simulator. If you are trying to capture a game that has the simulator genre but is still really an entertainment-based thing, something like SimCity, right? It has some level of civic knowledge, but the mayor doesn't have the right to bulldoze anything they want whenever they want and rebuild anything anytime and drop Godzilla in at the whip of a hat. So the difficulty there, you can be a little more flexible with it, you can play with it, and manage it as you need.
The real world issues with the sim games are, like if it's a difficult subject like surgery, or even like dealing with the tax structures in SimCity, there's not always one way to do it. There's not always a game option that you would have, like if you were actually fixing somebody's spleenectomy, there's multiple ways that you could do it, but the game only wants you to go one way. And then the other problem is making a gamified version of whatever's taking, which if, like in SimCity, what you would be building or what you would be doing would take years in real life, they have to distill it down so it only takes hours in the game.
Real-time strategy. The immediate difficulty of real-time strategy games tends to be management. They require two simultaneous areas of concentration at minimum. Base management and unit management. Base management boiling down to building your structures, gathering resources, establishing defenses, and kind of managing the location or locations that you exist on the map. Simultaneously, you have to deal with unit management, which is scouting, attacking, defending, micromanagement, like saving your individual units from death if a firefight breaks out and pulling a unit back and letting some other unit get hit and then pulling that unit back, or targeting specific enemy units and structures to try to eliminate certain threats quicker. There is a high difficulty curve to that because it requires rapid thinking, decision makings. It also requires a lot of knowledge of the control scheme. And this gets us down to like developing hotkeys, developing macros, giving your players tools to reduce the curve for how difficult or how quickly they can tell the game what it is they want it to do. Because players can usually visualize in a real-time strategy what it is they want their units to do, right? They can see a unit dying and want it to run away, but can their mind then tell the mouse to select that unit and right-click farther away so that unit moves away and so the AI has the wherewithal to attack a separate unit, which gets us down to APM, or actions per minute. The general measure in an RTS game of how well your players can provide inputs or commands to the game itself. The higher that demand, the higher the APM demand you put on your players, the higher the difficulty. And when it comes to your AI, a lot of the difficulty scaling in these games is based on how many breaks you are putting into your AI's APM. If your AI is intentionally waiting a couple seconds, making a command, waiting a couple seconds, making a command, it's more reasonable that a player is going to defeat that opponent than if you basically take the brakes off of your AI and say, make as many commands as you want, you know what you want to do to win a game or lose a game. An AI with no restrictor plates to its actions per minute, for the most part, is probably going to walk over any human player. And then the slightly less frenetic 4X games, Explore, Expand, Exploit, and Exterminate.
The first issue with these games, which you can design differently, that the players don't often know, obviously, what the enemy armies are doing. So they don't know the technology, they don't know the culture that they're fighting against. So the imperfect information that you have can often hinder you on how you make your decisions. But as a designer, you can institute certain things, ways to learn what the opponent's up to, like sending spies into the camp, and then you can make a better decision.
Yeah, and it's starting to happen less often, but one of the ways that the 4X genre really loved to manage its difficulty was to just fudge the numbers. You'll even notice even newer strategy games, I think games like Hearts of Iron, Civilization does this too. When you change the difficulty levels, it just applies multipliers to everything, right? Like the AI starts getting 1.5 times resources, or you get, twice the partisanship when you capture an opponent territory, or they're inherently going to be more hostile to you, more likely to declare war, less likely to offer you, alliances or treaties. Just playing with those numbers, usually, for most grand strategy games, is where a lot of the difficulty adjustment you have comes from. Because if your player knows what they can do, and in a turn-based game they have unlimited time to sit and make that decision, then you are usually beholden to a lot of numerical adjustments to scale your difficulty up and down. It's why the games tend to rely on it, because it tends to be the most effective tool in the toolkit. The last thing to mention on 4X games is, no matter how well you plan in a 4X game, one of the things you always have at your disposal as a designer is randomness, right? I remember in old Civilization games when I would discover, I would move my unit onto a little hut, and it would say the hut was actually a tribe of skilled mercenaries, and they're attacking you. And my armored tank with 7 strength and 8 defense or whatever is there, and it spawns a little, like, not even medievally, like an ancient legion or a light cavalry or something, and the light cavalry just goes boop, boop, blows up my tank. Because in Civilization there was a certain amount of randomness to the combat system. No matter how good your unit was, there was at least some chance the other unit could win, and the AI had nothing to lose because it was a randomly spawned barbarian unit, so of course it attacks, and I just happened to lose a very expensive and valuable unit in my army. General rule of thumb in design, the more random your game, the more you kind of bring the skill and the difficulty curves down so that they can play with each other, the less random, right? So you always have that at your disposal if needed. Which gets us into cross-genre difficulties, the kind of things you can play with regardless of the type of game you're trying to make. Designing difficulty for multiplayer, for starters, it can be really hard to balance the relative skill of players in a game. Local couch games, right? You're always gonna have one player who might be better at that, and it's not like you can swap that player out for somebody else based on a rating. You don't have multiple couches behind you with other players waiting to jump into your local multiplayer game. And matchmaking systems that are online don't necessarily always have that either. Sometimes you're kind of stuck with the group that you get assigned, and there may just be too big a gulf in skill between those players, and your game as designed may not offer enough randomness or other functions or rubber banding to try to help players who aren't necessarily the best at the game have a chance at winning. By varying your difficulty, again, playing with this luck and skill interplay and adjusting the mechanics of your game in such a way that the second, third, fourth, or fifth best player in a game has at least an opportunity to win, will highly increase the engagement in these multiplayer tiles. And just remember that people can be really hard on each other. I don't need to tell you that online is not always the friendliest place to play games. And there is going to be that effect. You need to be aware, and community managers are a blessing. If you are making a game, you need at least one. Understanding the dynamic of your game and the sort of the social interactions and the way that the players in your online world are sort of working with each other is hugely important to making sure that you're designing an experience from a difficulty perspective that they can all enjoy.
And keeping in mind goals, so if you telegraph what you want the player to do too much and handhold them in order to make it just kind of like a linear story, they're going to be bored. And if you let them go, drop them into an open world game and don't kind of give them any clues as to what to do, they're going to be lost and confused and quit. So that's something that you kind of need to balance when you're designing, kind of making sure you're telling your story, but giving the player the feeling of freedom to kind of discover it on their own.
Yeah. For enemy AI, enemies that learn, have the ability to identify a player's actions and then adjust to them, can become increasingly difficult to the point that they may themselves be too difficult after a while. You need to understand that if you're going to be developing a learning AI, that you have to somehow adjust the scalars for your players. Are your players able to pick up more skills or abilities? Do you notice that the AI is learning faster than the player, slower than the player? You're charting multiple skill difficulty tracks, and we'll look at the chart here in a second. And you need to be savvy enough as a developer to understand how you need to either coach your players or adjust your numbers on the back end so that those two sort of simultaneously curves match up as best as possible. And I will say, it is really easy to make an AI that everyone can beat. It is really easy to make an AI that will not lose to anybody. It is really, really hard to make an AI that's 50-50 with humans it goes up against. We have been fighting AI development for decades now. I will tell you things like OpenAI and Google's DeepMind are going a long way towards making good, balanced AI because we can feed them thousands upon thousands of games, and we can develop an AI that knows how to beat people, and then we can scale that AI back to an AI that knows how to beat people half the time. It's a really exciting time to be developing an AI for sure.
And then my biggest thing to keep in mind is when you're designing a game, keep in mind your audience. If you're making this lovely Winnie the Pooh game, which is supposed to be just like a sports game, and the CPU won't let you hit a ball ever, then that's a wrong audience because you're gearing it towards children, and kids are going to pick this up and their parents aren't going to be able to beat this game. The same thing with things like The Lion King, which was a platformer in Sega where it was ridiculously hard. But again, children are buying this. That's who it's geared towards, but it's not who should be playing it. So just consider your audience, please.
Yeah, how many educators set up Oregon Trail expecting that their students were just going to learn about their journey across the West, only to realize that they have killed off their entire classroom?
They all have dysentery.
So yeah, always think about your audience. Think about who you are making the game for, what groups, what age groups, and design accordingly. And here is one of the most important charts you will ever see from a game design perspective. The difficulty curve, you will hear this referred to as flow a lot. The general concept here is that there is an increase of your skill as you play a game, and then an increase in a difficulty the farther into that game you get. The goal is to roughly create an experience where your player is starting at the bottom left and ending up at the top right. It is possible, however, to adjust this, right? You can tweak a player up this by making subtle adjustments to enemy reaction times, the likelihood of good items appearing, enemies not getting as lucky, you getting luckier. Very subtle tweaks that you can make on the back end to give players the sensation that they are, accomplishing things, but more importantly, you're just kind of very quietly tipping the scales. Not everything you need to do needs to be done through the UI, right? If you have a loot box and you open it up and it has a 1% chance of having a blue item, and a blue item might really help a player get through a level, maybe the second time they go through that stage, it's a 1.5% chance. Maybe the fourth time they go through that stage, it's a 2% chance. Maybe the 10th time they go through that stage, it's a 25% chance, right? You don't have to necessarily allow players to stay unlucky forever. They don't need to know that you're making those changes or adjustments to the game. You're perfectly capable of doing that. There's slight exceptions to that, like MMOs, where the numbers are available on the API in the front end, and you don't want to make that knowledge available to your player base. But you do have the ability to play with this stuff. And then there's also diverse difficulty adjustments.
So there's obviously like the slider levels like in Doom where you can change your modes of easy, medium, hard, but there's other sliders that you can start to introduce into your games, like adjusting the difficulty of puzzles, the number of enemies, the number of mini games, mission parameters. Those are kinds of newer things that you can introduce into your game that the player then can adjust the level of difficulty in different aspects of the game itself. So don't be afraid to get creative with that, because it really helps the player stay engaged and makes it a game for everybody.
Yeah, and that's probably the most important point to end on here. There are 5 lanes in this diagram that end with the word fun. for a reason, right? Lots of people get different enjoyment out of games based not just on the difficulty, but the result of that experience. There are people who play a hard game who are really good at that game who will find it a balanced fun. There are people who are really not great at games who will play that game and may find it fun, just really, really hardcore fun, right? The trick is understanding the range of your audience and trying to keep as many of them kind of in that area as possible, and when possible, adjusting your game's difficulty or having the range of difficulty settings in your game to try to populate as many of those lines as possible. Because the more of those lines you have open, the more people playing the game, the more people enjoying the game. And with that, we've got about 5 minutes. We can take a couple questions now, and then I guess we can take the rest of them offline. So the question is about Myst VR and if that, like playing it in virtual reality, adjusts the difficulty. To an extent, I actually just went through Myst again because we picked up Game Pass about a month ago. Myst is unique in that it doesn't do a great job of highlighting locations that are interactive. You kind of have to discover by clicking around what is and isn't available for your use. But they do change that in the VR version of the game. As you kind of drift your cursor over things, they will highlight, give you some indication. I think of things like the Stone Ship Age. It's a lot easier to manipulate the levers. In Channelwood, it's much easier to tell because you have ambient, stereoscopic sound. It's much easier to actually tell where the water is flowing through the pipes and see, okay, yeah, so I need to adjust this one, and that'll make that, carriage go up to the second level, because they do, from a presentation standpoint, because it's a stronger presentation, it is a little easier to tell where some of those things are. So I do think it was a slightly easier experience playing it in VR than it was with the original QuickTime version of the game. And take one more question. No? Oh, yeah. Why was there a butter knife attached to that pedal, Alex?
It's to fix the Rock Band pedal so you can drum again. If it's broken in half, you are screwed.
Yeah, so
it's one of the life hacks.
The pedal was cracked, because you keep stepping on the pedal, and this is for the,
the drum set.
Not the snare, whatever it's called. The foot pedal for the drum. That was cracked, so that he taped the knife to it so that there'd be a hard metal plane to hold it so that the entire thing would go down and trigger the foot pedal. I can't think of a better question to end on. So thank you all for coming out here. Have an excellent rest of your TooManyGames 2021, and we'll see you later.